history of Jacksonville begins most appropriately with the history of the St. Johns River, because the history of our great city is the history of the river. Geologists tell us that our natural history began over 5 million years ago, so we have a very long history indeed. And during this time, the St. Johns was drowned many times over by the Atlantic Ocean, so that we might say that we ourselves, this land and this river, are children of the Atlantic. Because of this flooding, the magnificent river does not have the characteristics of other old winding rivers. Instead, it can be better described as a series of coastal lagoons, linked one after another like great pearls on a thin chain. Into this type of environment came the first known inhabitants, the Paleo-Indians, or the ancient ones, some 16,000 years ago.
The story of the ancient ones is the story of small nomadic hunting parties coming onto the peninsula to stalk prey, coming into Florida along the trails which form US 1 today. These bands of Indians camped along the riverbanks at places where animals gathered and crossed. Camping on the high ground in the vicinity of what is now Liberty Street, they set up traps and waited for the animals to cross the river. The Indians, of course, did not know that the source of this magnificent river system could be found nearly 300 miles south, in a tiny area called Blue Cypress Lake. With humble beginnings, this mighty river flows north from what is now Lake Wilmington, through Lake George and Lake Monroe, before it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. It is one of the few major rivers in the world which runs north. The name of this mighty river changed according to the inhabitants along its banks. Some of the earliest settlers living at the mouth appropriately called it Walatka, or River of Lakes. Because of the frequent floodings, many shorelines were dotted with bluffs, which later served as boat landings. The first European intrusion into this land was by French Huguenots traveling up the coast from the south, seeking a place to found a new France. More than half a century before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, Captain Jean Ribault braved the passage across the bar from the Atlantic Ocean to the river. According to some accounts, the waters at the mouth of the river lifted as high as 50 or 60 feet during high tide. Ribault and his men crossed the bar in small boats, and on May 1st, 1562, offered a prayer of thanks, claiming the land for King Charles of France. Ribault named the river Rivière de Mai, or the River May, marking the date of this significant passage. Huguenot colonists then began building Fort Caroline, which became the first significant European settlement in this new land. The next 250 years witnessed a clash of nations, seeking dominance over the river and over the lands it passed through. Following their settlement in St. Augustine, the Spanish became interested in this area, destroyed the French fort, and renamed Fort Caroline San Mateo.
One of the glories of our history, and there are many, is the work of Father Francisco Pareja, whose mission, San Juan del Puerto, was on present-day Fort George Island. Father Pareja, a gifted linguist, listened carefully to the language of the Timucua Indians who were his charges. He wrote it down, created a grammar, and wrote several theological works which were later printed in Mexico City. When these books were returned to Fort George Island, the Indians learned to read them, learned to write in their own language, and were soon writing letters to themselves as well as to the King of Spain. The irony of all of this is that the language was the oldest existing language on the North American continent, at least 8,500 years old. It literally had its back to the sea, surrounded as it was by Muskogean dialects. It was the first language to be systematically written down in the New World, and the oldest.
Spain continued to dominate the land for the next 150 years. Sometime in the mid-18th century, the name of the river begins to appear on maps as San Juan. From a 16th century Indian missionary settlement, San Juan del Puerto, on present-day Fort George Island, we get the name San Juan or St. John. It is not known why the Indian village was named for St. John or when it was named, but it is the name of the river which remains. British involvement began in Florida in 1733, when General Oglethorpe landed in Georgia, established Savannah, and almost immediately began to move south. He built Fort George and began moving down the east coast toward St. Augustine, capturing Spanish forts and claiming the land for England. But he never captured St. Augustine. Characteristic of his nature, Oglethorpe engaged in battles until he seemed to tire of them. Before reaching his goal, he stopped his ventures, saying that hurricane season was coming and that it was time to go home. The British withdrew from Florida. Although the Spanish maintained sentinel posts and fortifications on the St. Johns, the river remained quiet for more than 2 decades. Ironically, it was a peace treaty, not a battle or war, which returned Florida to the British. Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in order to regain Havana. At that time, Florida stretched all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It completed the southern portion of the 13 colonies, so the British took this land eagerly. They subsequently divided it into 2 provinces, East and West Florida. A line was drawn on a map beginning at the St. Mary's River, with everything to east belonging to the English and everything west going to the Seminoles. James Grant was appointed the first royal governor of this province. In 1764, Governor Grant signed a proclamation encouraging settlers to come to East Florida by offering a number of land grants. Within a very short time, a number of plantations had sprung up along the river, rivaling the Spanish settlements of an earlier period. One of the significant accomplishments of the British was the construction of the King's Road along the high places between South Georgia and into Florida. This road became the main line of commerce. On this road, various trips were made by the 2 Bartrams, William and John, who came into Florida to study the flora and fauna and to beautifully chronicle the wild and wondrous sights. The King's Road crossed the St. Johns River at a narrow point called the Cowford.
The Cowford, a place where cattle could cross or ford the river. A rather uninspiring name for a place, to be sure, but it was actually at that point, that narrow point of the river where cattle could cross. The name is generally misleading. The river at this point was not shallow enough for cattle to wade across, as many believed. The river was actually very deep, and in order to ford the river, cattle had either to swim across or be ferried across. And so it was that a ferryman's house and a tavern for weary travelers was built there. Naturally, when the British built the King's Road along the high places from southern Georgia and on to St. Augustine, the roads crossed here, and Jacksonville had its beginnings.
The second royal governor of Florida was brought in just as the revolutionary spirit was catching on in the colonies to the north. Determined to defend East Florida against these Americans, Governor Tunin sought alliance with the Creek Indians. He sailed on the provincial yacht, the St. Lawrence, from Piccolata to the northern shore of the Cowford. It was on this ship, not under the Treaty Oak, as many people believe, that the Creek Indians agreed to fight for the great King of England. 3 treaties were signed. The war erupted shortly thereafter. The main line of defense for the British was the St. Mary's River. The second line of defense was the St. Johns. The East Florida Rangers routinely ventured into Georgia and stole cattle for the British garrison in St. Augustine. One of the more colorful figures who became proficient in this art was Daniel McGirt. Following the war, he returned to his farm on McGirt's Creek, the present-day Ortega River, from where it is rumored he continued his escapades. The only Revolutionary battle fought in Duval County was the Battle of Thomas Creek, now the dividing line between Duval and Nassau counties. Georgia militiamen came into Florida on the King's Road and by way of the Intracoastal Waterway. Several small skirmishes followed involving the militiamen, British regulars, East Florida Rangers, and Indian warriors. Although the Loyalists fought successfully to keep the rebels from taking East Florida, any British longings for an uneventful future were shattered with the signing of a treaty between Great Britain and Spain. The Floridas were returned to the Spanish in 1783, marking the beginning of a second Spanish period. But the Spanish sovereignty had trouble enforcing law and order in the Floridas. Lawlessness and revolution were rampant. Sir Gregor McGregor, one of the many pirates who came into Northeast Florida during this period, was sent by a number of revolutionary governments in South America to take Florida away from the Spanish. He captured a little place at the northern banks of the river called the Cowford in June 1817. U.S. troops were sent down by President James Monroe to protect the borders. Major General Andrew Jackson was directed to raise troops to support efforts on the east coast of Florida and to conduct operations in the western panhandle. Jackson undertook the mission with enthusiasm, perhaps too enthusiastically. Jackson raised 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, partially financed with his own funds. En route to Florida, he added to his forces Georgia militiamen and Creek Indians. On Monroe's orders, he entered Florida, chased Seminole warriors into West Florida, captured a number of forts, and by the end of May had taken Pensacola. Confrontations ended in February 1819 when the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed. With this treaty, the United States acquired Florida in return for giving up claims to Texas and for agreeing to pay Spanish debts owed to U.S. citizens. In 1821, President Monroe rewarded Jackson for his initiatives by appointing him the first U.S. governor of Florida. Citizens had been talking about founding a town, and Isaiah D. Hart suggested that it be on the undeveloped land on the north side of the St. Johns. A 20-block town was planned. Citizens named it Jacksonville, in honor of Major General Andrew Jackson. With a population of about 100 people, residents petitioned Secretary of State Adams to designate Jacksonville as a port of entry for foreign trade. This date, June 15, 1822, is accepted as the founding date of the city. The little settlement at the bend of the St. Johns River was now a respectable community. Jacksonville had come of age. Interest in surrounding areas of Jacksonville had been growing too. John Houston McIntosh, a wealthy East Florida planter, owned plantations on Fort George Island and what is now known as Ortega. After killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel in New York and having nearly drowned in a hurricane near Little St. Simon's Island, Aaron Burr visited McIntosh on Fort George Island. While at the plantation, Burr drafted a letter to East Florida Governor Enrique White. No one knows what Burr wanted to discuss with White, but historians speculate that he may have seen an opportunity in East Florida to make a name and a fortune for himself. If so, others had dreams of Florida empire as well. President Madison was instrumental in sending agents into Florida and creating the Patriots' Revolt of 1811, an attempt to capture Florida for the United States. Fort San Nicolas, the site of the present-day athletic field at Bishop Kenny High School, was an important fortification during this uprising. In 1813, Zephaniah Kingsley moved to Fort George Island to farm. He leased and later purchased the property from McIntosh. Although he grew cotton, citrus, and a variety of vegetables, Kingsley's main business was slave trading. He transported slaves from the African coast to Florida, where he trained them in handicrafts and a variety of skills before smuggling them across the border to sell. Although an advocate of slavery, Kingsley's own wife, Anna High, the daughter of an African king, was herself black. Kingsley and his family received so much criticism from the local community, he moved his wife and children to a plantation in Haiti in 1836. Kingsley wrote in his will, "I do also solemnly enjoin my colored and natural children that seeing the illiberal and inequitable laws of this territory will not afford to them and to their children the protection and justice which is due in civilized society to every human being." He went on to direct his heirs to maintain a will and to find some land of liberty and equal rights, where the conditions of society are governed by some law less absurd than that of color. Kingsley had not found that to be true here. In the late 1830s, Jacksonville began to be known as a health resort, and by mid-century was experiencing significant growth as a trade center. Business activity included shipping, cotton, and timber. Jacksonville was changing and growing, and its population was expanding. Sailing ships and steamers dotted the horizon. The first public schools were opened. William John Mills and other residents began lobbying Tallahassee to incorporate Jacksonville, believing the town would not flourish otherwise. The charter was approved, and Mills was elected the first mayor in 1832. A native of St. Augustine, he fought for what he believed in. He promoted a lottery as a scheme to raise money to complete construction on the courthouse. Even though the town charter prohibited gambling, He voted to approve the incorporation of St. John's Parish in 1834, and he vehemently opposed statehood. Two obstacles stood in the way of Florida becoming a state: a small population and a tax base too low to operate a state government. Apparently, residents of Florida were reluctant to pay taxes even then. But in 1845, a referendum was authorized and statehood was approved. Mills left Duval County for California, claiming that Florida was becoming too civilized. During this period, two Seminole wars had been fought. The Seminole Indians were known for fighting when they wanted to fight and hiding when they didn't. By 1842, with no Seminole chiefs available to sign a peace treaty, the war was declared over. With the end of the war, the prosperity that had previously eluded Jacksonville arrived with the influx of settlers and a growing number of tourists. Hotels and boarding houses were built. The Judson House was built in 1852 on the corner of Bay and Julia Streets at the time when Bay Street was within a block of the St. Johns River, unlike today.
You see, my family had been already here before there was a Jacksonville. It was known as Cowford from its British days. But in the early days, because that river was there and because we had a reasonably warm climate, Jacksonville became the tourist city of the United States. It was not the further south city. St. Augustine was, but Jacksonville had the river. St. Augustine did not. So Jacksonville became the Mecca of not just the United States, but people from Paris and London came here to enjoy the winters and the sunshine.
Tourism began to flourish, but any promises of a peaceful and prosperous future were once again interrupted. With pre-war tensions mounting, Florida seceded from the Union in 1861, and Confederates began fortifying the St. Johns River. Sherman and his Union troops landed at Mayport Mills, threatening to capture Jacksonville. There was a panic in the town. Ferry boats were converted into gunboats. Fire was exchanged. And on February 20th, 1864, the most significant battle of the Civil War fought in Florida occurred in the pine forest east of Lake City. Given the length of time and the number of casualties, the Battle of Olustee was the bloodiest battle of this war between the states. Wounded soldiers were taken to Jacksonville, where temporary hospitals were set up in churches and homes. Union soldiers occupied the town. In a military communique, Jacksonville was described as pathetically dilapidated, a mere skeleton of its former self. A military transport carrying the baggage and camp equipment of Union soldiers struck a torpedo near Mandarin Point. The Maple Leaf sank in 20 feet of water, where it remains today, buried in the muddy bottom of the St. Johns River. By the summer of 1864, the war was virtually over in East Florida. Jacksonville, a victim. Federal engineers began repairing the railroads and restringing telegraph lines. The Civil War was ending, and the tourists began returning. The beauty of the river and the appealing climate did bring many visitors to Jacksonville, including soldiers from the war, now returning with their families. Great hotels offering fine food and good music were built. The St. James Hotel, which stood where the St. James building is today, was one of the finest tourist hotels in the United States, as well as the Windsor, the Grand National, and the Carlton House. The 1876 City Directory listed 12 hotels and 3 dozen boarding houses. Famous visitors were not uncommon. Harriet Beecher Stowe spent many winters at her family residence in Mandarin. Steamboats were known to stop routinely so visitors could catch a glimpse of her. General Robert E. Lee arrived aboard a steamboat in 1870, and Stephen Crane came to Jacksonville to await passage to Cuba on the ill-fated Commodore, which produced his famous short story, The Open Boat. While in Jacksonville, Crane met and fell in love with Cora Taylor, hostess of the Hotel des Dreams, who later became his wife. Frederick Delius arrived from England in 1884 to try his hand at raising oranges, but it was music, not farming, that enamored Delius with his surroundings. Listening to blacks singing in the romantic surrounds of the St. Johns River, Delius first felt the urge to express himself in music. Although it was some years later in Europe that Delius composed the haunting bittersweet themes of the Florida Suite, it was the memory of the river and his love for the people which produced it. Jacksonville was then known as the most frequented resort in Florida, Pablo Beach, later renamed Jacksonville Beach, opened as a tourist resort in the 1880s. Riverboats traveled the St. Johns, and schooners could be seen anchored along the wharves to receive cargoes of oranges, turpentine, and cotton. Jacksonville was also an established industrial center, boasting 5 lumber mills, 2 brick yards, and 14 cigar factories. 14,000 tourists were reported in 1870. The number increased to nearly 50,000 by 1875. The population doubled and sometimes tripled during the winter months. Although the railroad had helped to establish Jacksonville as the tourist city in the country, it also contributed to its demise.
At the time, a man by the name of Mr. Flagler, who is well known these days, came in and built a railroad, the Florida East Coast Railway. And he built the bridge, which is runs right along parallel to the Acosta Bridge. That railroad bridge was the first crossing of the St. Johns by any kind of a structure. The railroad then was run to St. Augustine, and the Ponte de Leon and the other hotels and buildings were built by Flagler down there, and the tourists started going to St. Augustine, and before long the railway inched its way on down to what is now Daytona, West Palm Beach, and eventually reached Key West, you know, over the years. So Jacksonville became a non-tourist town.
As the tourists began moving farther into South Florida, city leaders tried to rekindle interest in the area by sponsoring a subtropical exposition. Colonel J.J. Daniel, who helped recreate the Board of Trade, now the Chamber of Commerce, was instrumental in putting together the exposition of 1888. President Grover Cleveland and his wife attended the exposition in February of that year. A reception at the St. James Hotel brought out so many people who wanted to shake the president's hand, the access from the street to the hotel literally collapsed from the wait. During the exposition, a fever of unknown origin began spreading throughout the city. Several people died before it was diagnosed. By August, it became evident that Jacksonville was in the throes of a yellow fever epidemic. In an effort to fight this mysterious disease, cannons were fired, hoping that the concussion would kill the germs. Pine wood and tar were burned, blanketing the town with thick smoke to purify the air. People were moved into temporary camps outside the city, and fumigation stations were set up to handle the outgoing mail. A search for the cause of the epidemic seemed to point everywhere except at the mosquito. By December, over 4,000 people had contracted the disease. 427 had died. Freezing November temperatures finally brought an end to this terrible ordeal. But the combination of the railroad moving south and the effects of the epidemic had dealt its fatal blow to tourism. Jacksonville residents had witnessed many changes and faced many challenges over the years. As the turn of the century approached, new challenges awaited.
Part of Jacksonville's history of which we are not very proud is that of segregation. But the reality is that for a period of time there were virtually 2 cities, a white Jacksonville and a black Jacksonville. Each of these communities had its own churches, its own schools, its own forms of entertainment, its own doctors and hospitals, its own business districts, and its own sense of pride.
James Weldon Johnson was born in Jacksonville in 1871, but it would be a number of years before Johnson would learn of racial prejudice. Jacksonville was then known as a good town for Negroes. This was a period of Reconstruction. Remnants of the Civil War could be found in any boy's collection of rusty bayonets, old belts, and brass buttons. This was the time when a good Negro baseball team was a tremendous drawing card for large audiences of whites and blacks. A black doctor, a black municipal judge, black merchants, land stewards for the steamship company, policemen, and city councilmen were part of the social fabric. In his autobiography, Along This Way, Johnson described the Jacksonville of his childhood.
I was born June 17, 1871. Jacksonville at that time was little more than a village. Bay Street, then the main street, turned its back, as it still does, on the St. Johns River. And from the rear of a row of 5 or 6 blocks of low wooden and brick buildings, several rickety wharves jutted out into the magnificent stream. Of course, waterfronts had not yet entered the list of civic responsibilities. From the river, the town extended back 8 or 10 blocks and straggled out on the 3 sides. North and west of the town was a forest of tall pines, and to the east, where the river makes a bend northward before taking its course to the Atlantic, there was a thick grove of oaks.
He writes about himself that when he grew up in Jacksonville, it was the best of times. It was during the Reconstruction period, so it was a time when blacks felt good about himself, and to be born during that time has to be really be great. And he was born to special parents, middle-class family, educated, and I think some things did concern James Weldon Johnson about Jacksonville.
Perhaps Johnson sensed that things would change. Perhaps Johnson was concerned that although there were schools for black children, a high school education was still not available without leaving the area, as Johnson had to do. Johnson returned to Jacksonville with his degree and became the principal of the school where he had started. Recognizing the need for a local black high school, Johnson added a grade level each year he served at Stanton until the high school was complete. He and his brother Rosamond composed a special song in honor of the first graduating class. Little did they suspect that this song would become known as the Negro National Anthem.
I can remember when I was a girl, those words, we learned those first. I think I learned Lift Every Voice and Sing when I was in kindergarten. And one of the verses that I liked best was probably the last one. That's very, you sing it like a prayer almost. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in your arms, we pray.
During Johnson's time, Jacksonville had experienced many changes. Tourism had flourished, died back, and flourished again. The Civil War was over, and former slaves were now free. Reconstruction brought black representation in government, as well as the carpetbaggers and the scallywags. Epidemics of smallpox and yellow fever had broken out, decimating portions of the population. The people of the city had faced much adversity and many challenges. The new Republican government was regarded by some as an artificial creation by outsiders. Others saw it as a chance for change. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress to help newly emancipated blacks, had opened 3 schools in Jacksonville, as well as the largest Freedmen's Bank in Florida. Black representation in government became fairly common. A prominent member of the black community and a contemporary of Johnson's was Eartha Mary Magdalene White. Although not political, she received national recognition for her humanitarian work. Many newly emancipated blacks found themselves in office. But this post-war period of grace was short-lived. In 1876, Reconstruction ended and a period known as Redemption began, in which conservative whites returned to power. When a new state constitution was written, devices such as poll tax and literacy tests were included to take the vote away from blacks. Although many black citizens throughout Florida did lose their vote, some Jacksonville blacks, many of whom were property owners and educated, were able to retain their voting status. A new city charter was established in 1887, which restructured the government and annexed the suburbs of East Jacksonville, Springfield, Brooklyn, and Riverside. But with the yellow fever epidemic of 1888, the mayor and other public officials fled the city in panic. Volunteers stepped in to help this floundering government. As Jacksonville struggled with its local government, the United States declared war on Cuba in 1898. Although the Spanish-American War was short-lived, regiments of troops camped out on Ionia Street in the Springfield area, as well as in Pablo Beach, now Jacksonville Beach. Colonel William Jennings Bryan came to Jacksonville and was the commander of the 3rd Nebraska Volunteers. A signal station was erected at Fort George Island, but no Spanish warships were sighted. Soon hostilities ended, the peace treaty was signed, and the troops departed. And then, at the turn of the century, Jacksonville faced the greatest disaster in all its history. At 12:30 p.m. on May 3, 1901, a moss fiber factory located at Beaver and Davis Streets burst into flames. The roof of the building collapsed, sending incendiary particles in all directions. The fire quickly swept towards the business district and into the residential neighborhoods. The parish hall of the First Presbyterian Church burned quickly, as did homes and public buildings. As the fire approached Hogan's Creek, the wind shifted, causing it to move south towards the river. The smoke and flames which filled the Jacksonville sky could be seen for miles. Within 8 hours, everything in its path was destroyed. 146 city blocks had burned. Over 2,000 buildings were destroyed. 10,000 people were left homeless. Property losses exceeded $15 million. Every public building, except one, had been destroyed. This was the greatest disaster in all of Jacksonville's history. It was indeed an awful visitation. Community response was immediate. By the next morning, an extensive relief and rebuilding program had begun. Relief committees were formed. Donations were sent in from all over the country. Commissaries were set up to dispense food, clothing, bedding, and carpenter's tools. Tents were set up on vacant lots for temporary shelter. H.L. Mencken, then a cub reporter of the Baltimore Morning Herald, arrived within a week with 2 railroad cars full of relief items. The people of Jacksonville began rebuilding their city, and the city grew at an unprecedented rate. Springfield, which had not been damaged by the fire, experienced a tremendous surge of growth. The city population increased from over 28,000 in 1900 to over 57,000 by 1910. And within that decade, an entirely new city was built. A New Yorker named Henry Clouthier and other notable architects designed commercial and residential structures in a new style, which became known as the Prairie School of Architecture. By 1913, Jacksonville's population had grown to more than 85,000. W.W. Douglas, city editor of the Metropolis, reported, "No city in the world ever recovered faster and better, and this fact alone amazes the home folks and the strangers." A decade after the fire, many felt that the city of Jacksonville was greater and better than ever. This was the new Jacksonville.
Well, I've always been emotionally tied to Jacksonville because I've lived here all of my life and many generations of my family before me. My father was involved as a very young man in the first runs of the old ocean-going tug known as the Three Friends, which his cousin Napoleon Bonaparte Broward designed and built. And my father, until 1940, was on the St. Johns River every day of his life. And then for the last 26 years of his life, he was the engineer of the ferry boat Fletcher, which ran from the south side of the St. Johns River to the north side.
Steamship and riverboat travel was very popular on the St. Johns. Side-wheelers and paddle-wheelers took people down to Green Cove Springs, Palatka, and Lake Monroe. The Clyde Line provided steamship service between Jacksonville and New York for more than half a century. Jacksonville also became known as the world's winter film capital. Hundreds of movies were made here each year. Calum Studios, one of the first motion picture studios to maintain its own salaried actors, directors, and crews, was located on Talleyrand Avenue. Clouthier set up a studio in Springfield next to his house. Oliver Hardy got his start here when he was hired temporarily when a fat boy was needed for a comedy role. Many stars came to Jacksonville to make films, including Lionel Barrymore, Ethel Barrymore, and Victor Moore. It was not uncommon to see camera crews on the streets. By 1916, there were at least 30 firms with studios employing 1,000 part-time and full-time actors. The first Technicolor film ever produced was filmed in Jacksonville, with a specially equipped Pullman car being brought in to process the film. But the romance between Jacksonville and the motion picture industry began to sour. Residents complained when bank robberies were filmed during Sunday morning church services, when false fire alarms were set off to bring out the fire trucks, and when chase scenes went through the center of town, endangering the safety of the citizens. One stage mob scene got out of control when a saloon and a 2-story building were nearly destroyed. The movie people, on the other hand, disliked being charged outrageous prices for the privilege of using a private home as a backdrop. They complained of the high cost of goods and services. The antics of the movie makers became a political issue in the mayoral election of 1917. When Mayor Bowden, who supported the motion picture industry, lost his bid for re-election, the industry began moving out, and Jacksonville residents had few regrets. As attention turned toward World War I, the movie industry lost a prime market in Europe, and the people of Jacksonville lost interest in the movies. The construction of the Mayport jetties before the turn of the century had opened the port of Jacksonville to shipping. A number of ships, wooden, concrete, and steel, were constructed at local shipyards during the war. Camp Johnston, now the Naval Air Station, was designated a remount station for 27,000 officers and enlisted men. Concern about German submarines off the coast ran high. Mass meetings were held and public safety committees were formed. Jacksonville residents were prepared for war, but the threat was short-lived, and Jacksonville citizens turned their attention to matters at home. In the summer of 1917, people began to question the need for a bridge across the St. Johns River, and the first in a series of bridge debates was launched. Nevertheless, advocates for the bridge put the issue on the ballot, and in July of that year, Duval County voters approved the sale of a $950,000 bond issue for the construction of the Jacksonville-St. Johns, now the Acosta Bridge. This bridge, which spans the deepest water in Florida, was opened in 1921 with a gala 3-day celebration. Completion of the bridge opened the South Side to development. 2 years earlier, the Union Station on Bay Street, replacing the old 1897 railway station, had opened without fanfare. Described as a magnificent structure, this terminal was the most modern type possible and equal to any station in the world. The excellent rail system contributed to the good distribution from the port. The terminal remained in operation for 45 years before closing its doors to passengers. The railway and shipping industry continued to grow, and Jacksonville became a major distribution and export center.
When I was a boy, the downtown Jacksonville riverfront was wars for commercial vessels coming in, unloading bananas and various things, taking them off. The Clyde Mallory line, for instance, had its boats coming in here and running to Philadelphia and New York and so on.
The 20s was indeed a period of unprecedented growth and prosperity, otherwise known as the Florida boom. The value placed on buildings increased dramatically. A number of skyscrapers were built along West Adams Street. To the south, a $6 million development called San Marco was announced. The residential developments of Lake Shore, San Jose, Lake Forest, and Venetia were started. Pablo Beach, experiencing increased land sales, was renamed Jacksonville Beach, and there was talk of building a second road to the already popular area. Many industries found Jacksonville attractive, and a strong commercial base with a diversity of interest was established. It was this economic diversity that helped the people of Jacksonville weather the storm of the Great Depression better than many other urban areas.
On the south side was a separate city, South Jacksonville, where I grew up. And it didn't become part of Jacksonville until the early 30s. I would sometimes, as a child, take a rather alone walk down Bay Street in front of all of the bars and learn many things about life. Many foreign languages from the sailors in port, prostitutes, gamblers, you name it. It was an alive city because all of this matrix was made of a cross-section of the world that were coming into Jacksonville. The city grew at this unprecedented and unbelievably creative rate with this ambiance of really beautiful and far-reaching architecture, which was published and was known all over the United States. And here was this local man and a group of other architects creating unbelievably beautiful and wonderful things that the locals didn't quite understand, but other places were publishing. And people were coming here to see it.
Jacksonville did attract many well-known visitors. Many black entertainers came to town. Jacksonville resident Charlie Singleton wrote the popular Strangers in the Night, among others. Between the 20s and the 40s, Ashley Street was the hottest black entertainment spot in Jacksonville. In 1943, Mrs. Annabelle Remley composed a song about Jacksonville. It was first performed by her son, Harris Remley, in his senior year at Lee High School. Later recorded by Billy Butterfield and Keeley Smith, Mayor Frank Whitehead proclaimed the Jacksonville Blues, Jacksonville's official song.
I'm going right back to Jacksonville.
The early 40s brought the Navy in preparations for World War II. German saboteurs were arrested after planting explosives in the sand dunes at Ponte Vedra Beach. Shipbuilding increased. Because of the cold winters in the north, shipbuilders could not work long. But in Jacksonville, warships could be constructed 24 hours a day, 12 months a year. Before the war's end, Jacksonville shipyards would build more than 100 Liberty ships, tankers, Victory ships, minesweepers, and PT boats. The end of World War II brought peace and prosperity to Jacksonville.
This is Jacksonville, your city. Gateway to Florida, potential metropolis of the Southeast. It's a city that is just winding up a decade of phenomenal growth and just starting out on another one. In its fine natural harbor stretching along the banks of the beautiful St. Johns River, there is both shipping and shipbuilding. A steady flow of motor traffic back and forth across a modern four-lane bridge. Downtown in the shopping and business district, there's an endless hustle of activity, air of prosperity. The crowd moves with sure purpose along the busy streets, looking as though they know where they're going, know how to get there, and are in fact already on their way. All of it says plainly and quite proudly, this is Jacksonville, city with a future.
The boom years of the 50s followed. Another surge of growth occurred, although scattered and unplanned. Arlington's population exploded when the John E. Matthews Bridge, the original bridge to nowhere, was completed. The Fuller Warren Bridge also opened in the early 50s. In 1955, the Florida legislature created the Jacksonville Expressway Authority to build and maintain the first expressway system in the state, with responsibilities for more than 125 miles of expressway and highways and 4 bridges. Jacksonville was expanding. The downtown riverfront was changing from a setting of wharves and warehouses for commerce to a cityscape of skyscrapers, bridges, and parking lots. City with a future. But were we neglecting a part of our present? Where were the residents that had found Jacksonville to be a good town for Negroes at the turn of the century?
I came to Jacksonville 70 years ago when my community of Jacksonville was strictly a divided city. White, black, white, black. Segregation was rampant. I lived in a building on the east side of Jacksonville, 1 block from Main Street. And on the corner of Main and Union, there was a restaurant. What segregation had taught me was so uncalled for. Because when I went into the store to buy a sandwich, I ordered it. The girl went into the back to prepare it, and I thought I would sit down until she came back. But the gentleman came out and said that I couldn't sit down. So therefore, I told him to keep his sandwich.
Jacksonville was segregated, and it would be some time before strides were made toward an integrated society. As is true throughout Jacksonville's history, no significant changes were made without a struggle. Rutledge Pearson became the major force in the fight for human rights in Jacksonville. Committed to the cause for freedom, he dedicated his life to his work.
We live by the philosophy that none of us can be free until the lowest one among us is free. I'll be sitting up there, I'll be sitting up there, well, just come on up to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting up there. You know the word, sing the verse now.
Described as the Martin Luther King of Jacksonville, Rutledge Pearson met an untimely death in a car accident in 1967. Mary Singleton and Sally Mathis were the first 2 black city council representatives since Reconstruction. They were joined by attorney Earl Johnson in 1968. But the struggle wasn't easy. Janet Johnson explains.
Because during that time, we had a couple of race riots, and He was the NAACP lawyer for the state of Florida. That meant he was in court long hours, and I wasn't sure whether he was still in court or whether he was killed or what. It was very difficult times.
Times were difficult. Like other southern cities, the implications of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education were not being addressed. In 1964, 15 Duval County schools were disaccredited, but the disaccreditation had not come without warning. These and other problems may have been symptomatic of an ever-deepening crisis in local government. City and county officials were either unable or unwilling to address numerous urban problems. A month after the high schools lost their accreditation, Claude Yates, president of the Chamber of Commerce, called a meeting of 23 Jacksonville business and civic leaders to study the problem of local government. A one-sentence request was sent to the Duval County delegation, asking them to sponsor legislation to establish a local government study commission. This document, later called the Yates Manifesto, opened the door for restructuring Jacksonville's government. The study commission was organized October 1st, 1965. It would be several years before consolidated government would become a reality, and not without struggle.
We were here forcing it to change, and we were here to enjoy the change. My husband served as secretary to the committee who wrote the new government, the new consolidated city government of Jacksonville, the bold city of the South. And so we were a part of this growth and this horizon, and we feel very native to this. This is our city. We help make it be, you know.
The voting strength is recognized throughout America. This isn't the America that I was born into. This is America, a new people, a new world with new people and new ideas that we live in today.
This history of Jacksonville, as interesting as it is, does not tell the complete story. It does not tell of the poverty amidst the prosperity. It does not tell of the industrial policy which was satisfied with a low-skilled labor force. It does not tell of potential industry which examined and then passed by our community. But it does tell of a city which recognized and tried to correct its ills. It does tell of a city made up of caring, concerned citizens trying to work together to create a progressive, vibrant image of their community, and it does tell of involvement.
The people of Jacksonville seem to share a spirit, a fighting spirit, if you will, a spirit that says these may be tough times, but we'll make it. That spirit has carried us into and through the 80s. A lot has happened since James Weldon Johnson's day, when Jacksonville was little more than a village.
By the way, that same gentleman who owned the cafe, say it must have been, I can't recall the year, but it was a couple of years. He wanted to represent my district, and that part of Main Street and all out east. And so he asked, say, how's that doctor's wife down the street there? They say she's very well thought of in the community. You think she'd help me? Now, he forgot all the time that he had refused to let me sit until the person had made the sandwich. But those days have gone. Those days have long gone.